So with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Linda Golley. So Linda, there you go, and it's all yours.
Hello. Let us begin with the fact that interpreters and translators are paid by the service providers in each sector. Service providers have no intrinsic interest in providing a living for interpreters or translators. If interpreters are not able to provide what the industry needs, industry will move on. In my sector, which is healthcare, we are mandated to provide equal access to care for non-English speaking patients. We have traditionally provided this support in two ways, one of which is to have interpreters present during face-to-face visits between patients and their care team members, and we interpret back and forth so that the message goes back and forth. The second way that we support our patients is by translating medical documents. Right now, interpreters are viciously arguing with each other about which modality is superior or absolutely unacceptable for supporting face-to-face doctor appointments. And translators are arguing with each other about what is the best quality assurance method. Do we do back translation? How many translators do we have involved in every document to make sure it's absolutely perfect? But the train has left the station. We are arguing about the wrong things. Healthcare is very complex, and it has actually moved away from providing care in face-to-face visits. For every face-to-face visit that a patient has with his doctor, nurse, therapist, he probably has a dozen or more interactions with the healthcare system which are not face-to-face. He has to talk to his pharmacy on his own, his insurance company, his medical records offices from around the world, wherever he came from. He has to talk to financial aid, and he has to make contact with a lot of places that his own team referred him to. In order for him to make those contacts and to get his needs met, the patient now has to use the phone. Sometimes he has to use a text system or an email system, because that's what that piece of the healthcare system uses. He may have to read or write or even access the internet. More and more we have healthcare forms, documents, and portals which are on the internet and cannot be accessed any other way. In order for healthcare organizations to provide language support properly so that patients can actually get their healthcare needs met, we will have to map our communication and our information pathways. Once we have mapped the pathways, we can figure out how to provide language support at each of those interfaces. We are going to need tremendous help from our technological innovators, which is why I'm extremely happy to be on the stage with our technological innovators. The difference between a communication pathway, as I call it, and an information pathway is that a communication pathway involves a back and forth conversation between the patient and someone on his care team. This can be in real time, such as by phone, or it can be delayed, such as via text or email. An information interface, as I define it, is static content, such as intake documents, patient education documents on the healthcare side, and the patient himself maintains documentation, such as his self-care logs, if he has been told to keep track of his mood, his fertility, his dietary intake, his blood pressure, and so on. There is a tremendous amount of work out there for medical interpreters and translators. That's the good news. But we have to reset to fit into where the activity is. And I'm going to just show you some examples of healthcare interfaces that are there now. They will increase in number, where we're already seeing a deficit of language support. We have not yet figured out how to provide language support for these interfaces and many others that won't fit on this slide. They told me to take about 2/3 of these interfaces off the slide because it would make it too busy. This shows a patient needing to go onto the internet to look up health education information. This is a teleconference medicine episode where the doctor is in one place, the patient can be in another country. Where do we fit the interpreter into this? This is a talking pill bottle. More and more we realize that a lot of patients have poor compliance with their medication regimens because they can't read that pill bottle. Well, we're just starting to do that in English. How do we get that translated into Burmese? More and more, we're going to be prescribing apps to patients so that they can monitor their own biostats and report that back to their doctor. Either they will report it back or we'll have it reported back automatically to the office. We need to get that translated. We need the patient to be able to understand the instructions of how to use it in the first place. We send a lot of customized document sets out to patients. This guy is going to have surgery. He needs to be able to read his instructions. Just 2 days ago, we had a patient have his surgery canceled because he had received a whole packet in English and didn't understand certain critical elements of that. If a patient is in a bed and he's got a very nice computerized set of things that he can call his nurse for, let's make sure we get that translated. To remain viable, interpreters and translators have to be able to do a more complex set of activities seamlessly. They need to be able to interpret and translate the conversation that's going on. If there's a conversation going on by text or by email, we need that translated and fed back into the system. It could be the EPIC system, which manages patient messaging. So we need people to be better cross-trained. Let me give you an example of an interpreter's day. For example, let's say it is interpreter Nguyen, who is at home with a full digital workstation. For a couple of hours, he receives and translates a batch of emails and texts back and forth from patients and doctors. He sends those back. Then he does a phone interpretation for a patient who is seeing a diet counselor. And he has brought his complex medication, insulin logs, and nutrition logs to that visit. And that is the main point of his visit. The dietitian can send by attachment or by fax this diary to the interpreter, who can sight translate that as he would if he were sitting in the room with them. And as the dietitian gives new instructions to the patient, as she provides teaching to the patient, the interpreter, of course, conveys that orally to the patient over the phone, but he also audio records what he is saying, and then he sends that file to the patient's email address so that the patient has that at home so that he can remember what his instructions were. I am predicting a drastic change in the distribution of work for medical interpreters and translators. Now, I made these numbers up, but I actually interviewed a bunch of English-speaking patients and asked them for the list of what they had had to do in the last 2 weeks to deal with the healthcare system. And if I posit that that person is non-English speaking, and I translate that into where we need to do language support, I've made a rather revolutionary prediction here. Most interpreting for visits will become remote because the patient is not in the same room as his healthcare provider in the first place. We call up and say, my tummy hurts, well, have you tried this, and on and on and on. It's not that often that we're in the same room. So telephonic interpretation is going to be absolutely huge. Video interpretation will happen to quite a large extent also. But we're going to have a lot of things that wouldn't have been on this chart at all. Translation of active healthcare conversations is the second bar down here. This is not complex translation. This is not where you have a document written in stone and it's going to be static. This is conversational translation. I think maybe that's a new concept to a lot of us. And we need to be ready to work with not just the agencies and the hospitals and clinics, but we need to be able to work with the companies that are managing these new complex pathways. For example, the appointment managing systems now control all of that messaging back and forth via email. That, for example, a company like Epic. Telephone answering systems where you tell the patient, call this number after hours if you're in labor. That messaging system has to include a way to provide language support. We need to be able to fit in as interpreters with those companies as they are developing their products, because otherwise we're locked out. And that's a scary thing. It may be 10 years before we have another chance. So go rattle the cage. And this is my contact information. I welcome your ideas and your comments. Thank you.
Thank you.